The atmosphere had transformed from a celebration into something resembling a courtroom. Except my father was not the judge tonight. He was the one on trial. My husband's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Calm, measured, deliberate. He had the kind of tone that made people lean in, desperate not to miss a single word. "I've watched men like you my entire life," he said, his gaze never leaving my father. Men who command rooms with their arrogance. Men who confuse fear for respect. Men who build walls of power so high, they think no one could ever climb over them. The guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, sensing the depth of the confrontation. My father tried to maintain his composure, sitting tall, lips pressed into a thin line. But I could see it, the crack forming in his armor. And then my husband began to peel it away. He spoke of his own career, not in detail, not yet, but enough to plant seeds of curiosity. He told the crowd that his work had taken him into boardrooms where the stakes were higher than money, into circles where reputations were currency, and one slip could ruin an empire overnight. A murmur of recognition swept through a portion of the audience. Some of the older, more seasoned men who clearly suspected something. My father, however, sat rigid. He wasn't a man who liked surprises, and this was quickly becoming one he couldn't control. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. This is only getting started. As my husband spoke, I found myself staring at him in awe. I realized that for years, he had let me believe he was simply a quiet, supportive partner. But in reality, he was so much more. Every word, every pause, every glance toward my father was calculated. He was unraveling a story in front of an audience, and he was doing it masterfully. Finally, he shifted the narrative again, this time. To me, "I married your daughter," he said, addressing my father directly, his voice steady. "Not because she was the weakest link, as you called her tonight, but because she was the strongest person I'd ever met. A woman who endured more than anyone should have to endure. A woman who, despite being pushed down, found the strength to stand up again and again. That's what strength looks like. That's what resilience means." A ripple of applause broke out, tentative at first, then growing louder. It wasn't the thunderous clapping that my father had received earlier, but it was real, genuine. And in that moment, for the first time, the room wasn't laughing at me. It was applauding me. My throat tightened. Tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. I refused to let my father see me break again. My husband waited until the applause died down, then leaned closer to the microphone. His next words sent shivers through the crowd. "You've spent your whole life hiding behind your reputation," he said. "But the thing about reputations is, they're only as strong as the secrets they're built on." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the hall. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked at my father, others at my husband, as if silently begging him to go on. Would you like to see your own father confronted like this? Tell me in the comments below. My father's mask of control was slipping fast. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. He tried to laugh, a hollow sound that fooled no one. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but even his voice cracked. My husband didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the interruption. He simply continued, each sentence sharp, deliberate. "There are people in this room tonight," he said, "who know me. People who have done business with me, though most of them didn't realize who I truly was. And there are others here who will soon learn that I am not just the man who married your daughter. I am the man who holds the power to reveal truths you've buried for decades." The murmur turned into a low buzz of conversation. Whispers darted across tables like sparks leaping from fire. Faces turned pale, brows furrowed, hands tightened around champagne glasses. And me? My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Who was my husband really? I had always respected his privacy, his reserved nature. I knew he was successful, that he had connections beyond my understanding, but I never pressed for details. And now I was realizing that maybe he had kept it from me, not out of secrecy, but out of strategy. Because this moment, was what he had been saving it for. Are you ready to hear the truth about him? Smash that like button if you are. He ended his speech abruptly, as if pulling the rug out from under everyone. But I think I'll leave it there. For now, the crowd erupted, questions flying, voices rising, chairs scraping against the polished floors. My father's face flushed a deep shade of red, his composure shattered. He had walked into this evening expecting admiration, but instead, he was being cornered in front of everyone he respected. And me? I sat there in stunned silence, my hand trembling in my lap. I had no idea where this was going, but I knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer just a retirement dinner. This was the beginning of my father's downfall. And my husband was the one pulling the strings. Stay tuned. In the next part, the secrets my husband begins to expose will not only humiliate my father, but will also reveal a truth that changes everything. The room was chaos, guests whispering, others leaning in to speculate, and all the while my father sat rigid, his face betraying the fury simmering beneath his forced smile. For a man who thrived on control, this was his nightmare. The spotlight shifting from praise to suspicion, and the very foundation of his reputation beginning to crack. But my husband wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He let the commotion swell for a moment, before calmly raising his hand. The crowd hushed instantly, captivated. There was something about his presence, something magnetic, that silenced even the boldest voices. And then, he began again. Your entire career has been built on perception, he said, looking straight at my father. On making people believe you are untouchable, flawless, a man of iron discipline. But what happens when the mask slips? What happens when the people who admire you learn what lies beneath? A chill ran through the room. Every word was a dagger aimed at the heart of my father's carefully cultivated image. Are you still watching? If this story has you hooked, hit that like button right now. My father tried to interject. He rose halfway from his seat, his voice strained. This is my night. Sit down before you embarrass yourself. But my husband didn't even blink. He let the words hang there, then leaned into the microphone. The only embarrassment here, he said, is the truth you've been hiding. And then, like a curtain being pulled back, he began to reveal it. He spoke of deals my father had made in the shadows, of favors exchanged behind closed doors, of opportunities that mysteriously fell into his lap while others were sabotaged. He didn't accuse outright, not yet, but he painted a picture, vivid enough that the guests began connecting the dots themselves. Every raised eyebrow, every sharp intake of breath was another nail in the coffin of my father's legacy. I sat frozen, my mind spinning. I had suspected my father wasn't as honorable as he appeared. But hearing these things spoken aloud, in front of everyone, was staggering. And the most shocking part, my husband knew details I had never heard before. Would you want your father's secrets revealed like this? Let me know in the comments. My father's face turned ashen. He tried to laugh it off, to wave dismissively, but his usual charm fell flat. The whispers around the tables were too loud, too relentless. People weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with suspicion. And then came the twist. My husband revealed that he wasn't just an observer, not just a man who had pieced together rumors and half-truths. No, he had been directly involved in the same circles where my father operated. He had watched my father's rise from the sidelines, unnoticed, biding his time. But unlike my father, he hadn't built his empire on deception. He had built it on strategy, alliances, and a kind of power my father couldn't even comprehend. The room gasped. Suddenly, his earlier words made sense. The boardrooms, the influence, the control. He wasn't exaggerating. He was telling the truth. And as the realization sank in, my father finally snapped. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice booming. Enough, this is nonsense. Lies from a man who envies what I've achieved. But even as he spoke, his desperation was obvious. His voice cracked, his hand shook, his face glistened with sweat under the harsh lights. He wasn't the unshakable figure everyone thought he was. He was unraveling. My husband didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness was more powerful than any outburst. You call it envy, he said softly. But the truth is, I don't need to envy you, because everything you spent your life chasing, I already have. The wealth, the influence, the respect. The only difference between us is that I didn't destroy my family in the process. The silence that followed was deafening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. This is only getting more intense. I could feel tears welling in my eyes again, but this time they weren't from humiliation. They were from vindication. For years, I had endured my father's cruelty, his dismissive words, his relentless comparisons, and now, in front of the very people he had sought validation from, his empire of arrogance was beginning to crumble. But my husband wasn't done. He leaned forward, his final words for the evening precise and devastating. Tonight, you wanted the world to celebrate you. Instead, the world will remember this as the night your mask fell. And this is just the beginning. I haven't even told them everything yet. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. And my father, he sank back into his chair, defeated, his face pale, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. I knew then that my husband wasn't bluffing. He had more, much more. And whatever it was powerful enough to finish what he had started tonight. As the evening came to a close, guests left not with fond memories of my father's career, but with questions. Questions that would haunt him. Questions that would follow him into every conversation, every handshake, every glance. And for the first time in my life, I walked out of a room beside my father and felt taller than him, stronger, freer, because I knew his downfall had only just begun. Stay with me, because in Chapter 3, my husband begins to reveal the secrets that will not only destroy my father's reputation, but also change the way I see my own family forever. The morning after the retirement dinner was eerily quiet. In our home, sunlight streamed through the curtains, but instead of warmth, it carried an almost chilling reminder of what had happened the night before. My phone buzzed endlessly. Messages from relatives, friends, and even strangers who had been present. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What exactly had my husband meant by his words? But my father, he stayed silent. Not a call, not a message. For a man who never let anyone else control the narrative, his silence spoke volumes. It was the first sign that he understood the damage had already begun. My husband, on the other hand, was calm. He moved about the morning as though nothing unusual had happened, brewing his coffee, skimming through the newspaper, a faint smile playing at his lips. It unsettled me and comforted me at the same time, because if he wasn't shaken, maybe I didn't need to be either. I finally asked him, my voice trembling, "What did you mean when you said you hadn't even told them everything yet?" He looked at me, eyes steady, and said, "Because the truth isn't just about him. It's about all of us." Those words hung heavy between us. Are you still watching? If this story has your attention, type yes in the comments right now. Later that afternoon, news began to spread. Small whispers at first. Rumors about backroom deals, about how my father's sudden promotions, all those years ago, weren't as clean as they seemed. Guests from the dinner were telling others what they had heard, and the story was multiplying. What was supposed to be my father's crowning moment had turned into the spark of his undoing. By evening, my father called a family meeting. Reluctantly, I went. My brother was there too, his expression tense, caught between loyalty and doubt. My father sat at the head of the table, his face stormy, his voice sharp. He humiliated me, he snapped. In front of everyone. And you, his eyes cut to me. You just sat there and let it happen. His words pierced, but this time, they didn't break me. Not after last night, not after hearing my husband stand up for me. But before I could respond, my husband spoke. His tone was calm, but each word carried weight. I didn't humiliate you. I revealed the truth. There's a difference. The tension was unbearable. My brother shifted uncomfortably. My father's fists clenched, and I waited, heart pounding, for what would come next. And then my husband dropped the first real bombshell. He revealed that years ago, he had worked in a powerful corporation that dealt with my father's company. He had seen, firsthand, the shady dealings my father was involved in, the under-the-table payments, the falsified reports, the way he manipulated others to climb higher. He hadn't just heard rumors. He had proof. My father's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about, he barked, but his voice lacked conviction. Oh, I know, my husband replied smoothly. I know because I was there. I sat in the meetings. I read the documents, and I watched as you sacrificed not just your integrity, but your family, for the sake of power. Don't forget to hit that like button if you think the father is finally getting what he deserves. My brother turned pale. His entire life, he had idolized our father, believing him to be a pillar of honor and strength. Now, his world was being shattered, piece by piece. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers, but another part of me was strangely relieved. For years, I had felt like the problem child, the weak one, the disappointment. But now I was beginning to see that the real weakness had never been mine. It had always been his. My father, desperate, tried to strike back. You think you can destroy me with stories. No one will believe you. But my husband only smiled. They already do. Last night was just the beginning. Every whisper, every doubt, it's spreading. And soon, it won't be whispers anymore. It'll be headlines. A silence fell over the table. The weight of those words was suffocating. Where are you watching this from? Comment your country below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I realized then that my husband had been holding back for years. He had seen my pain, my humiliation, and he had waited for the perfect moment to strike. And when my father had mocked me publicly, he had given him that moment on a silver platter. But even as the truth began to come out, I sensed something darker beneath the surface. Because my husband had said this wasn't just about my father, it was about all of us, which meant there was more, secrets I wasn't prepared to hear. That night, as we left my father's house, I asked him again softly, why now? Why reveal this now? He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through everything. Because he hurt you one time too many, and because you deserve to know who he really is. Before I show the world, his words were both comforting and terrifying. Because if what he had revealed so far was only the beginning, then the next chapter of this story was going to change everything, and I wasn't sure if I was ready. Stay with me. In Chapter 3, Part 2, the revelations deepen. My husband exposes secrets that not only threaten my father's reputation, but also unravel truths about my own family that I never could have imagined. The weeks that followed passed like heavy clouds, thick with tension and silence. My father and mother, once united in their devotion to appearances, began unraveling behind closed doors. Arguments seeped through the walls of their grand home, muffled yet sharp. My mother's voice, usually calm and restrained, now carried fury and betrayal. My father's once commanding tone trembled under the weight of his secrets being dragged into the light. It was strange, almost surreal. to see the mighty patriarch I had once feared. Reduced to a man scrambling for control, he no longer held court at family dinners with his smug stories. He no longer dared to belittle me with casual cruelty. Instead, he avoided my gaze entirely, as though the truth exposed by my husband had stripped him of his authority. And yet, there was a cruel irony. Despite his humiliation, despite his loss of respect, my father still clung to pride. He couldn't bring himself to apologize. Not to me, not to my husband, not even to my mother. He carried his shame like a tattered cloak, unwilling to set it down, but incapable of hiding the holes that had been ripped into it. Meanwhile, whispers spread beyond the confines of our family home. Friends, neighbors, and even colleagues who had once admired my father's career began questioning the truth. Retirement dinners that were meant to celebrate his accomplishments became conversations about his arrogance, his hypocrisy, and his inability to value those closest to him. His legacy, something he had cherished above all else, was beginning to crumble. Through it all, my husband stood by me with quiet strength. He reminded me, gently but firmly, that revenge is not always about shouting the loudest or striking the hardest. Sometimes, revenge lies in patience, allowing the truth to rot away the very pedestal on which someone stands. His words gave me peace, yet deep inside, a restless fire burned, because I knew this was only the beginning. My father's public humiliation was satisfying, but it wasn't complete. He had taken so much from me, my self-worth, my confidence, my belief in my own voice. One night of exposure could not repay years of emotional scars. I wanted more, and soon, the opportunity arrived. My father, desperate to salvage what remained of his dignity, began reaching out to old business partners. He whispered to them of new ventures, of ways to prove he still mattered. He tried to convince others that he was not finished, that he could rise again, greater than before. But what he didn't know was that my husband already had his eye on these moves. He had connections of his own, far stronger than my father could have imagined. Quietly, without fanfare, my husband began placing obstacles in my father's path. Deals collapsed before they could begin. Partnerships dissolved before they could solidify. Every step my father tried to take toward rebuilding his reputation was met with invisible resistance, and I watched. I watched as my father's frustration grew, as his confidence faltered, as he realized he was no longer the man who could command respect with a phone call or a handshake. He was trapped in quicksand, and the harder he fought, the deeper he sank. One evening, I sat by the window, the moonlight casting its pale glow across the room. My mother's voice drifted through the house, sharp and cold, cutting into my father once more. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Revenge wasn't just about bringing someone down. It was about reclaiming the power they had stolen from you. It was about reminding yourself that you were never as small as they made you believe. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. And as I watched my father's empire collapse around him, brick by brick, I knew this was only the second act of a much larger play, because the real reckoning, the one that would break him in ways he never expected, was still to come. The storm inside my father's life was far from over. By now, his reputation was fractured beyond repair. Old friends stopped calling, business partners pulled away, and even the neighbors who once admired him avoided eye contact when they crossed paths. He was no longer the man who stood at the center of admiration. He was a relic of arrogance, unraveling in silence. But what he didn't realize was that the most brutal wound was yet to come, and it wasn't going to be delivered by strangers, rivals, or society. It would come from within his own family. I had grown up believing I was invisible to my father. No matter how hard I tried, my accomplishments never measured up to his impossible standards. He praised my brother, celebrated distant relatives, even boasted about acquaintances. But when it came to me, his daughter, there was only criticism and dismissal. I carried that weight for years, and now, watching his downfall, I realized this was my chance to turn that invisible girl into the woman who held all the power. It began subtly. My husband, with his quiet but strategic mind, encouraged me to step into spaces my father never wanted me in. He introduced me to people of influence, people who respected me, not for my family name, but for my determination and intelligence. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter living in the shadow of her father. I was building my own light, and then came the opportunity that shifted everything. A prestigious charitable organization in the city was looking for new leadership on their board. My father had tried, years ago, to claim that position for himself, but his arrogance had cost him the role. When the opportunity resurfaced, it came not to him, but to me. I was invited to apply, encouraged by voices that had seen my quiet work in the community. I knew what this meant. Taking that position would not only solidify my independence, it would eclipse my father in the very circles he once ruled, so I accepted. The announcement came one evening, a glossy press release that spread across social media and newspapers. My photo appeared where my father's once had, my name celebrated in the same city where he was now whispered about as a failure. I was no longer the daughter of someone. I was simply me. And when my father saw it, the fury in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't smile. Instead, he sat in silence, his face pale, his jaw clenched, as though the weight of his own insignificance had finally settled onto his shoulders. For a man who lived for dominance, seeing his daughter stand taller than him was the cruelest cut. Are you enjoying this video? That night, I overheard him muttering to my mother, bitter and broken. He accused her of betrayal, of siding with me, of allowing this to happen. But my mother, exhausted from years of his pride, simply told him the truth, that this was long overdue, that he had made his own bed, and now he was being forced to lie in it. For the first time, I realized that my father wasn't just angry at me. He was terrified. Terrified of becoming irrelevant. Terrified of being replaced by the very person he had always underestimated. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that my husband and I had only just begun to tighten the noose. Because revenge isn't just about watching someone fall. Sometimes, it's about making sure they know exactly who pushed them. The family gathering was meant to be my father's attempt at reclaiming dignity. He insisted on hosting it himself, as though arranging dinner in his home would somehow restore the respect that had already slipped through his fingers. He invited cousins, distant relatives, and old friends, people who hadn't yet witnessed the full scope of his downfall. In his mind, this dinner would be his stage, a chance to remind everyone that he was still the commanding patriarch, still the man to be admired. But what he failed to realize was that the world had changed, and so had I. As the evening began, the atmosphere was stiff. Guests exchanged polite smiles. Laughter came in fragments, and my father sat at the head of the table, forcing confidence he no longer possessed. He raised his glass for a toast, but the words sounded hollow, rehearsed, desperate. He spoke of legacy, of family honor, of resilience, but every sentence carried the weight of a man clinging to something already gone. And then the shift came. As the meal unfolded, conversations began to drift. People asked about my new position with the charitable board, congratulating me, applauding the recognition I had earned. They turned their attention to me, not him, their voices filled with genuine respect. My name echoed through the room, not as his daughter, but as a woman of her own accomplishments. I saw the flicker in his eyes, that same rage from the retirement dinner, the same fury that had consumed him when my husband first revealed who he truly was. His grip tightened on his glass. His face darkened with every passing compliment directed my way. He was no longer the centerpiece of the evening. He was a shadow fading into the background. And then, as if fate itself had conspired against him, one of his old business acquaintances leaned forward with a pointed remark. He asked my father what new ventures he had been working on since retirement. Casually, perhaps even innocently. But my father faltered. His words stumbled, his explanation vague, unconvincing. The room grew quiet. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone could sense it. The emperor had no clothes. The man who once commanded respect could no longer even defend his own pride. And then came the final blow. My husband, calm and deliberate, spoke into the silence. He praised me, not as his wife, but as a woman of strength, intelligence, and independence. He reminded everyone that true success is not measured by ego or dominance, but by integrity and resilience. And as he spoke, all eyes turned toward me again, their admiration undeniable. It was the cruelest twist of fate for my father, that the son-in-law he had once dismissed, the man he had ridiculed, was now the voice that commanded the room, while he sat powerless at the head of his own table. Where are you watching from? Comment your country below. By the end of the evening, it was clear to everyone. My father's time had passed. The torch he had never wanted to hand over had already been taken, not by force, but by truth. As the guests departed, I caught a glimpse of him sitting alone, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. For the first time in my life, he looked small, so very small. And I realized then that this was not just humiliation. This was defeat. But even in that moment, I knew we weren't finished. Because the deepest part of his downfall wasn't public recognition or failed ventures. No, the deepest part was personal. The quiet destruction of the illusions he held about family, love, and loyalty. And that final strike was still to come. The family dinner had been a turning point. But what followed was the slow, merciless unraveling of my father's identity. He had always seen himself as the center of gravity in our family. The authority, the voice, the unshakable figure everyone orbited around. But now, the orbit had shifted. The power he once held had slipped through his hands, and there was no way to retrieve it. It started with my mother. For years, she had stood quietly beside him, enduring his arrogance, his dismissiveness, his obsession with appearances. She had once been his most loyal supporter, defending him even when he was wrong. But after the humiliation of the retirement dinner and the collapse of his reputation, something in her finally broke. I began to notice small changes. She no longer sought his approval for decisions around the house. She stopped accommodating his moods, stopped smoothing over his harsh words. Instead, she redirected her energy toward herself, toward me, even toward friendships she had long abandoned. For the first time in decades, she seemed free, and in that freedom, my father's loneliness grew. At first, he tried to regain control. He demanded her attention, raised his voice, attempted to remind her of the loyalty she owed him. But my mother no longer cowered. She looked at him not with fear, but with exhaustion. And in that quiet exhaustion was the sharpest blade of all, because it told him she no longer believed he mattered. Then came my brother. For so long, he had been my father's pride and joy, the golden child, the favored son. But even he began to distance himself. The truth my husband had revealed at the retirement dinner, the truth about my father's hypocrisy and secrets, had shaken him. He no longer defended our father blindly. Instead, he began questioning him, doubting him. And once doubt enters the mind of a son who once idolized his father, it can never be erased. Slowly, my father's empire of family loyalty crumbled. He was left surrounded not by allies, but by silence. And I watched it happen, not with glee, but with a strange mix of satisfaction and reflection, because revenge is not always about fire and fury. Sometimes it is the quiet erosion of power, the steady reminder that actions have consequences, and that the people you once controlled can learn to live without you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. But just when my father thought the worst was behind him, just when he convinced himself that humiliation was the final chapter, fate handed me an opportunity so powerful, so absolute, that it would carve the final scar into his pride. Because soon, he would face the one truth he had buried for years, the truth about my husband, about me, and about the life he had tried to diminish. And when that truth surfaced, it would not only destroy what remained of his pride, but it would also ensure that he could never rise again. The invitation came wrapped in expensive cardstock, embossed with golden letters. It was for a prestigious gala, an event my father once attended as an honored guest. Back in the days when his name carried weight, this time, he believed it would be his chance to step back into the light, to remind everyone that he was still relevant, still worthy of respect. He bragged about it for weeks. Though his career had ended, though his reputation was damaged, he spoke of the gala as if it were his rebirth. He pressed his suit, polished his shoes, and rehearsed lines of conversation he imagined would win back admiration. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this gala would not be his salvation. It would be his undoing, because my husband and I were invited too, not as background figures, not as quiet attendees, but as honored guests. My new role on the charitable board had placed me at the center of the event. My husband was celebrated for his influence, his quiet philanthropy, his ability to turn every room into one where people listened. And when we walked into that ballroom, all eyes turned, not toward my father, but toward us. I could see the shock in his face as cameras flashed, as greetings and congratulations filled the air around me. He stood in the corner, smiling tightly, waiting for his moment, but it never came. The spotlight had shifted permanently, and it wasn't going back. And then came the revelation. During the speeches, the host of the gala introduced the evening's key supporters, the individuals whose work and generosity had shaped the cause they were celebrating. My name was called. My husband's name was called. Applause echoed through the hall as we rose to our feet. And in that moment, the final piece of truth struck like a hammer. The man my father had once ridiculed, the man he had dismissed at the retirement dinner, was not just my husband. He was a quiet powerhouse, wealthier, more influential, and far more respected than my father had ever been. The murmurs spread quickly, like fire in dry grass. People whispered, glanced at my father, and realized the cruel irony. The very man who had built his pride on belittling others was now the one being diminished, not by strangers, but by the daughter and son-in-law he had underestimated his entire life. Are you enjoying this video? My father sat frozen, his glass trembling in his hand, his forced smile faltering as he realized the truth. There was no return from this. No speech he could give, no story he could spin, would erase the fact that the world now saw him for what he was, a relic of arrogance, living in the shadow of those he had tried to control. And as the applause carried through the hall, I caught his eyes across the room. For the first time, he looked not angry, not even humiliated, but broken. The pride he had carried all his life had finally shattered, and there was no one left to pick up the pieces. The gala had been the final public blow, but the true devastation settled in after the applause faded, after the lights dimmed, and after the last guest left. My father returned home that night a shell of the man he once pretended to be. The arrogance that had carried him for decades had drained from his face, leaving behind only exhaustion and defeat. At the dinner table the next day, he sat in silence. No stories, no boasts, no lectures about honor or legacy. My mother barely looked at him. My brother avoided conversation altogether. The house, once filled with his commanding voice, now echoed with the sound of his absence. Even when he was still sitting there, it was in those quiet moments that the weight of his downfall pressed hardest. He had lost the respect of the world outside, but worse, he had lost the loyalty of his own family. He had spent a lifetime demanding obedience, but in the end, no one was listening anymore. I watched him carefully, and though a part of me remembered the fear and hurt he had caused, another part understood the depth of his suffering. He wasn't just humiliated, he was erased. For a man like him, that was the most painful punishment of all. And yet, revenge has a way of digging deeper, of finding the softest places to strike. Because as much as his pride had crumbled in public, his greatest torment would come in private. My husband and I had built something he could never take from us: respect, stability, and love. We didn't need his approval anymore, and for the first time, he realized it. Every glance between my husband and me, every smile of support, every gesture of unity, was a reminder of what he never had and never gave. He had sought power, but he lost family. He had chased recognition, but he lost love. He had built a kingdom of fear, but in the end, he sat alone on its crumbling throne. Where are you watching from? Comment your country below. In that silence, I finally understood that the revenge was complete. It wasn't about anger anymore. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about showing him the truth he could never escape, that the people he dismissed were the very ones who rose above him, while he was left behind, powerless. And as I watched him shrink into the shadows of his own making, I felt the final weight lift from my shoulders. The quietness of my father's downfall lingered like a heavy fog over the house. He no longer stormed through rooms or demanded obedience. He sat day after day in silence, watching the world move on without him. The man who once lived for attention was now invisible, even within his own family, and for me, that was the sweetest revenge of all. Because revenge was never about shouting, never about meeting cruelty with cruelty. It was about showing him that life continued, that happiness bloomed, even after years of being dismissed and belittled. The power he thought he had over me was gone. The scars he left had become my strength. I poured myself into my new role, using my position to lift others who had been overlooked, just as I had been. My husband stood by me, steady as always, reminding me that love built on respect will always outlast power built on fear. Together, we became what my father could never be: partners, equals, a team bound not by pride, but by trust. My mother found her freedom too. She traveled, reconnected with old friends, and rediscovered joy in the simple things. Even my brother, once so tied to our father's shadow, stepped into his own life without the burden of idolizing a man who had never truly deserved it. As for my father, he faded, not in the dramatic collapse he once feared, but in the slow erosion of relevance. People stopped asking about him. His name no longer carried weight in conversations. He had built his identity on control, but in the end, he couldn't control the one truth he had always denied: that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned, and he had earned nothing. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Looking back now, I realize my revenge was never really about destroying him. It was about reclaiming myself, about proving, to him and to myself, that I was never the weak, invisible girl he tried to make me believe I was. I was stronger. I was smarter. I was more than his shadow. In the end, his humiliation wasn't delivered in one moment, but in the slow recognition that the daughter he had dismissed had become the woman he could never be, respected, admired, and loved. That was the true revenge, and it was complete. Welcome back to another story on this channel. Today, I have for you a tale that begins with humiliation, but ends in a way no one could have predicted. It's about betrayal, secrets, and a revenge so satisfying that you'll want to watch until the very end. So sit back, relax, and let me take you on this journey. And remember, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. From the outside, my father's retirement dinner looked perfect. The banquet hall was decorated with golden drapes and crystal chandeliers, the kind of venue chosen to impress colleagues, relatives, and lifelong friends. For him, this night was supposed to be a celebration of his legacy, a farewell filled with applause, laughter, and admiration. But for me, his only daughter, it became the night my deepest wounds were torn open in front of everyone. I had always been the quiet one in the family. My father, a stern man with an intimidating presence, never found pride in me the way he did in my brother. To him, I was fragile, indecisive, and ultimately disappointing. He never said those words directly, but his looks, his tone, and his comparisons made it clear enough. My mother would sometimes comfort me, whispering that he did care in his own way, but I never believed it. That night, as guests poured in, I clutched my husband's hand tightly. He was my anchor, the one who saw strength in me when nobody else did. His calm gaze reassured me that whatever happened, he was there. Are you watching with someone you love right now? Tag them in the comments and let them know you appreciate them. The speeches began, one after another. Old colleagues praised my father's dedication. Friends recounted stories of his relentless work ethic, his discipline, and his ambition. He was painted as a man of unshakable principles, someone who built his career brick by brick, sacrifice after sacrifice. And I will admit, it was impressive. But beneath that shiny surface, I knew the truth. He had built his empire while crushing the confidence of his own daughter. When it was time for family to speak, my brother went first. His words were smooth, filled with admiration. He spoke about how Dad had taught him everything: courage, leadership, determination. The room filled with applause. Then it was my turn. I stood, my knees trembling, and tried to find the words. I spoke of the small moments, of how his strictness had shaped me in ways I hadn't appreciated until later. I spoke of resilience, of learning to endure. My voice shook, but I pushed through, hoping he would see that I had, in my own way, tried to honor him. But when my speech ended, silence hung in the air. No applause, no warmth, only my father's smirk. He rose from his chair, took the microphone, and with hundreds of eyes on us, he began to laugh. She always was the emotional one, he said, waving at me dismissively. Not much of a backbone, unlike her brother, but that's fine. Every family has its weak link. The room erupted in uneasy laughter. Some chuckled politely, others shifted uncomfortably. My heart sank. I felt my face burn as humiliation spread like wildfire. My husband's hand tightened on mine, but I couldn't look at him. Tears blurred my vision as I sat down, small and powerless, once again reduced to nothing by my own father. But then something happened, something none of us could have predicted. My husband stood up. His presence alone commanded attention. Calm, collected, and firm, he walked to the center of the room. The guests grew quiet, sensing something was about to unfold. And that's when he began to reveal who he really was. Would you have stayed silent in that moment, or spoken up like my husband? Let me know in the comments below. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he attack. Instead, he introduced himself formally, addressing the crowd with a composure that demanded respect. He spoke of values, of loyalty, and of what true strength meant, not the kind that humiliated others, but the kind that lifted them up. Slowly, people began to realize that this was not just a speech. It was a revelation, a counterstrike against years of quiet cruelty. But just as the tension thickened, he paused, his eyes locked with my father's. and the air between them seemed to crackle. Everyone could sense it. Something deeper was about to come to light. The humiliation I had just endured was about to be avenged in the most unexpected way. And that was only the beginning. Don't go anywhere. The truth my husband was about to reveal would shake the entire room, and my father's perfect image would begin to crumble. The silence in the banquet hall was thick enough to choke on. My father sat there, shoulders squared, confident that nothing could dent his polished reputation. But as my husband held the microphone, the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Guests leaned forward, forks paused halfway to mouths, champagne glasses hovering in the air. Everyone was waiting, sensing that what came next would not be part of the scheduled program. My husband began gently, his voice calm, yet layered with authority. He spoke of how strength was often mistaken for dominance, how real power wasn't about belittling others, but about inspiring them. His words were eloquent, carefully chosen, and unlike the flowery praise my father had been showered with all night, his message carried weight. True legacy, he said, isn't measured by the fear you instill, but by the respect you nurture. Guests murmured in agreement, nodding slowly. My father's jaw tightened, for perhaps the first time that evening, his authority was being challenged. And then, my husband did something that made the room collectively hold its breath. He turned directly to my father, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "But perhaps tonight isn't the right time for me to explain what I mean. Maybe the better time is now." Every word seemed to hang in the air like a blade. Are you enjoying this video? Hit the like button if you want to hear what happens next. I froze in my seat. My pulse raced. I had no idea what he was about to say, but I could feel in my bones that it was something monumental. He began recounting stories I didn't even know he had collected. He described the countless nights I had cried in silence after being belittled, the way my father's criticism had chipped away at me for years. He spoke of the quiet resilience I had built, not because of my father's guidance, but in spite of it. The audience listened, stunned. My father's laughter from earlier now seemed bitter, hollow. His face, usually unreadable, betrayed the first flicker of unease. But my husband wasn't done. He slowly started weaving hints about himself into the narrative. He explained how he had grown up surrounded by men who thought they were untouchable, men who believed power excused cruelty. He had studied them, learned their games, and then surpassed them, not by becoming like them, but by outsmarting them. He painted a picture of someone who had lived in the shadows of influence, observing the mechanics of respect, wealth, and fear. Then he let the first truth drop. "I know a man like you when I see one," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "But I also know something you don't, because while you've been busy building your empire in this city, I've been busy building mine, somewhere much bigger and much higher." The room gasped. Whispers rippled through the crowd. My father's eyes narrowed, but I could see his grip on control beginning to slip. And yet, my husband still held back. He wasn't revealing everything, not yet. He was testing the waters, letting the tension simmer. Where are you watching from? Comment your country below. I'd love to know how far this story travels. I sat frozen, torn between shock and awe. All this time, I thought of my husband as my anchor, my quiet supporter. I never realized that beneath his calm exterior lay someone capable of turning an entire room upside down with a few carefully chosen words. As he continued, he shifted the spotlight from himself back to me. He told them how he had fallen in love with the woman my father called weak, how he had seen strength in the quiet resilience, beauty in the scars left behind by cruelty. He told them that true greatness wasn't measured in speeches or retirement dinners, but in the way you treated the people who trusted you most. And then he paused again. His eyes scanned the room, then returned to my father. "Tonight is your retirement dinner." a celebration of all you've achieved. But the truth is, some legacies don't end with applause. Some legacies end with exposure. The hall went silent again. Even the clinking of glasses had stopped. My father leaned back, a forced smirk stretching across his face, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew something was coming, and for the first time, he didn't know how to stop it. I could feel every heartbeat in my chest. My father had humiliated me in front of everyone. And now, before the same audience, my husband was beginning to dismantle the image my father had spent decades creating. And just as he opened his mouth to finally reveal who he really was, the lights in the hall flickered, the crowd stirred, and the tension reached a breaking point. The truth was about to come crashing down. Stay tuned, because in the next chapter, the revelation my husband makes will turn my father's perfect night into his greatest nightmare. The flicker of the lights drew a collective gasp, but just as quickly as it began, the chandeliers steadied, casting their golden glow back across the room. Yet the brief interruption was enough to amplify the tension. Every guest, from seasoned executives to lifelong family friends, now sat at the edge of their seats, eyes darting between my father and my husband.